I've actually done something like this before. At Yale, nearly 6 years ago, I told my life story to a group of people so they could get to know me better. Now the people are different. You could argue better. The setting is different. The lighting, you could argue worse. But more than anything, the story I'm about to tell is different. Almost entirely so than what I told my classmates just a few years ago. A senior in college, I knew my story wasn't over, but I didn't think it would be entirely thrown out and rewritten. The moments in life I used to place such importance on have drained away and evaporated. I haven't even tried to retrieve them. In past talks, I've seen students divide their life into chapters. I'll divide mine into books, 2 of them. A chapter feels like a continuation. A book feels like something new. Let me tell this story to you now, a story of how death, loss, and grief can destroy a person and remake them. How experiences can be more powerful than genes. On February 4th, 2019, my dad was killed. A drunk driver struck him on his afternoon bike ride while I was in bed over 1,800 miles away. The impact launched my dad above the telephone poles that lined the streets before he crashed into the concrete road below, dead. When my dad was killed, so was I. At least the old me. The new one, the one you've gotten to know over the past year, has been shaped by trauma, loss, and solitude. I am still getting to know him too. Book 1, Before. I was born in San Antonio, Texas, to Sandra Vasquez and Naji Kayruz. We were, by all accounts, an immigrant family. My mom was raised by her grandparents from Mexico, who picked grapefruits for a living, before meeting her real mother at age 9, who was a clothing worker. Somehow, some way, my mom became a doctor, despite growing up in poverty, an abusive household, and speaking English as a second language. She recently served as the medical director for the University of Texas at San Antonio and led a population of 35,000 students and 3,000 administrators through the COVID-19 pandemic. I am so proud of her. My dad, Naji, was born in Beirut, Lebanon, to a seamstress and a restaurateur. Much of his life in Beirut was colored by the Lebanese Civil War. His family's downtown restaurant called Coq d'Or was bombed, and my dad and his 3 brothers took refuge outside the city limits. They still attended school in Beirut and would race each other miles to see who could get there fastest. Circumstance made my dad and his brother incredible athletes. Among them, they held several records for marathon times in Lebanon. And in 1980, my dad competed in the Olympics in judo, where he placed 9th in the world. When I turned 13, blossoming into a beautifully annoying teenager, I'd ask my mom why I too was not on the path to become an Olympian, suggesting that the only variable that differentiated my athleticism from my dad's was her. We now have a really good relationship. But my dad was the closest thing I knew to a modern day superhero. On one occasion, he single-handedly fought off a group of militants so that his brothers could escape. After he fled persecution and became a surgeon in San Antonio, his actions rose, if you can believe it, to greater heights. During the holiday, he talked to a friend of a friend who was worried about a tumor in her neck. The stress of cancer was preventing her from enjoying Christmas with her family. On Christmas Eve night, my dad drove 4 hours to Houston to remove her tumor and then drove 4 hours back in time to spend Christmas morning with my mom and me. He sometimes didn't seem real. My dad was as smart as Tony Stark, as playful as Spider-Man, and as honorable as Black Panther. Anytime I called him, that was his bat signal, and he was there. In 1995, my mom and dad had me, their only child. They moved into a big house to accommodate 3 or more kids, but when I was 1 year old, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer and couldn't have any more children. My dad actually performed my mom's mastectomy and gave up all food or drink before 12 p.m., including water on days he would run marathons, as a sacrifice to God. He did that until the day he died. I can't tell you whether it worked, but I still have my mom, and she was supposed to have died 26 years ago. I was a quiet kid. I suffered from bad sinus infection the first 4 years of my life, and I actually couldn't taste or smell anything until about age 5. I eventually got sinus surgery, and I still remember the first thing I ever tasted: an orange popsicle that a nurse gave me in the hospital. It tasted so good. And the next year, I gained 30 pounds. In order to encourage me to keep coming out of my shell, my parents enrolled me in an all-boys military school. To say it was a success was an understatement. I don't know how my roommates got a hold of these pictures, but they kept asking me, why do you have so many medals? And why do you have so many more than everyone else? And why do you look like an installed child dictator? Uh, Unfortunately, the people who could answer those questions are not around anymore. A lot happened in middle school, high school, and college, but for the most part, things went pretty well. And I attribute much of that success to my dad. Those accomplishments I told you about my dad earlier, I never heard about them from him. Most of them I learned from friends or by digging through his old things after he was killed. He never wanted to cast a shadow for me to wither under. He believed that if I wanted to do anything, I could, and he would be there to help me. And help me he did. My dad's love language was doing math homework together. My dad was soft-spoken, and English was his third language. So for him, there was something comforting and certain about using numbers to communicate with me. Every night, he'd pull up a chair next to mine, and we'd do math. It started with addition and subtraction, but we did math together all the way through multivariable calculus in high school. I used to joke that my dad was the best teacher I ever had and the best student my teachers ever had. Some of those medals you saw earlier were because of him. I cherish those moments with my dad. And after he died, my uncle explained the extent to which he cherished them too. After I left for college, apparently my dad used to come home, wander into my room, sit in the chair next to mine, and cry. The crying likely didn't last long because I started to call him about my econ and stats PSETs in college. And our daily routine resumed, albeit remotely. Eventually, my senior year, I got to a class that terrifies every Yale student who encounters it: intermediate microeconomics. And it was the first class my dad couldn't help me with without attending the lectures in person. So I looked at flights from San Antonio to New Haven to see how much it would cost to fly him up every Monday and Wednesday. It was too much. This one, I'd have to do without him. A few days after my final intermediate microeconomics final intermediate microeconomics exam, I heard from the professor. She told me that I scored the highest grade in the class and asked if I'd like to be a TA for the econ department. I say this not to sincerely apologize for taking base econ as an MBA 1, but to share the good news, or to share the text I got from my dad after I shared the good news with him. Congrats, AK. I always knew you could do it on your own. It's a text I return to often now that I actually don't have him. Book 2, After. I was watching TV in my Upper West Side apartment when I got a call from my mom. I pressed end when I saw her caller ID come up the first time. I did the same thing when she called again. When she called for a third time, I answered. My breath stopped and my diaphragm started pressing up against my lungs so violently that I fell to the floor. I shook and I yelled and I went silent. I fumbled with my phone and I called my dad's number. I got his voicemail. I told him that I loved him. I told him that if he would just hold on, I would be there soon. I called him again and he didn't answer. I called him again and he didn't answer. The next time I saw my dad, his lips didn't move. His eyes didn't open. The body was his, but he was not there. His face, cold and bloated, only looked like him if I squinted. I picked out a suit for him, wandering through his closet that still smelled like him, and I inhaled, knowing I had but a few days before I lost that scent too. I spent an hour shining and reshining my dad's shoes. He used to do mine, and any scratch or scuff I left would feel like a betrayal. I wrote his obituary and gave his eulogy. The church was overflowing, and lots of people hugged me and gave me sympathies like, "He's in a better place," or "I'm so sorry for your loss," or "I'll pray for him." You know, the kinds of things people say when they don't know what to say. So cliche and unhelpful that I almost wish they'd never said them at all. The worst offenders tried to console me, telling me that things would get better with time, or that when I came to forgive the person who killed my dad, I would only then begin to heal. These types of statements never came from someone who had been through an experience like mine. It was always those who knew the least who were the quickest to offer advice. Others who had loved ones killed knew that silver linings are not to be mentioned. Sometimes a dark cloud is just a dark cloud, and that's life. One of the hardest days, one of the days I remember most vividly, was the day I saw my dad's cremation. My mom stayed back, unable to bear witness, but I felt a duty to be there until the very end, until the lips that didn't move and the eyes that didn't open were gone. Before my dad burst into flames, the permanency of the situation hadn't resonated. I'd find him in my dreams and sleep as late as possible, thinking that maybe I could pull him with me into the day. For a while, I could lie to myself and believe that eventually my dad would answer that phone call. But watching a body turn to ash is the ultimate truth, as is the realization that only a God can reverse that process. The closest I got to a goodbye was the hum of the incinerator. It's strange the duties we feel towards those who are no longer here. I spent a long time tying loose ends. I came to Stanford because it was the only graduate school my dad heard I got into. I recruited into consulting because my dad thought I'd find it fascinating, and I found a copy of Case in Point in his bedside drawer that he had bought and marked up in case I needed help. My dad was killed the week of my Night Hennessy interview, and the last website he ever visited was the Night Hennessy page. There was a safety and a surety in realizing the tangible dreams my dad had for me. They allowed me to stay in motion and feel connected to him. I studied case interviews at the same desk we did math together, and I could picture him sitting there. Eventually, I accomplished the last goals he had for me. Whatever compass I use next would have to be my own. At the beginning of COVID, I began searching for wisdom, trying to construct a steady platform to stand on in the absence of my dad. I retreated to philosophy, literature, and poetry, which I had studied at Yale, and found old friends in Plato, Dante, and Seneca, and new ones in O'Connor, Auden, and Rilke. I read over 70 works of philosophy and literature in the first few months of COVID. I immersed myself so much in these texts that I even began to look like a philosopher. And I suppose it's all the wisdom I gained that the 23 Fund keeps sending me emails asking if I'd like to be an advisor for GSB startups. This search for wisdom felt urgently important. Without my dad, I couldn't appeal decisions to anyone but myself. I still had my mom, but our relationship had permanently transformed. In the aftermath of my dad's death, I became as much a parent to her as she was to me. And as an only child, I had little family to turn to. What I couldn't get from family, I began to look for in friends. And it is one of the saddest truest, and most vulnerable realizations that perhaps no one let me down more than my friends. And let me be clear, I believe I have the best friends in the world. What I observe from them is more about human nature and not about any individual. To put it simply, no one can fully put themselves in your shoes. I so desperately wanted my friends to understand the pain I was going through, how acute and chronic it was at the same time. For the first few weeks, people were there, checking up on me, calling me. But eventually, the crowd thinned like it does after a concert, and I was the only one left. People moved on and forgot about my dad. I did not. The GSB teaches us how to be empathetic in obviously difficult conversation, how to let someone go, how to deliver and respond to bad news. But it doesn't teach us arguably something more impactful: the non-obvious times to initiate difficult conversations. If you take one thing away from this talk, I beg you, please text or call one friend who has lost a loved one in their life and check in on them. In 3 months, my dad would have been killed 4 years ago. Yet every birthday, graduation, Christmas, Father's Day, and Thanksgiving, I still think of him. I think of him on normal days. The pain does not go away, but the friends comforting you through it do. Be the person who stays behind at the concert. It will make you the dearest of friends. If my friends, the wonderful people closest to me, let me down, so too did society. As a victim of a crime, I went through the justice system. I missed many GSB trips and classes to meet with prosecutors and sit in hearings with my mom. I remember the judge mispronouncing my dad's name and acting like my case was an annoyance to her busy docket. I remember how she never acknowledged that my mom or I were in the courtroom. I remember when the prosecutors decided to plea bargain the case at the last minute because the optics looked good for them, even if it sacrificed justice for my dad. I remember delivering my victim impact statement to the person who killed my dad and seeing eyes not of remorse, but anger, that I was somehow responsible for her fate, that I was the bad guy. I realized that even when directly confronted with my family's suffering, people prioritize their own self-interest, however insignificant, over the real disaster of others. I repeatedly came up against this truth. My experience with these dark realities brought me close to other victims, victims of drunk driving, sexual assault, and other violent crimes. Victims who learned that they weren't listened to, not because their screams didn't travel, but because they fell upon deaf ears. We ignore these truths about life or downplay them when everything is going pretty well. And typically, you don't end up somewhere like the GSB unless things are going pretty well. I certainly knew this at an artificial level when I gave my life story at Yale, but they didn't seep into my bones, take root, and harden until my dad was killed. It's easy to think that friends are family until you need them to be. It's easy to think that the justice system works until you need someone to do justice by you. Only when the stakes are so high and you are so low do these truths reveal themselves. I sat inside my dad's old closet, nested between familiar shirts that no longer smelled like him, and I thought about these things. I thought about these things, and I cried. I mourned for my dad who shielded me from them, and for the old Anthony whose innocence had now been replaced by experience. Dark truths and old shirts do not make for pleasant company. I called my dad's phone, knowing he couldn't possibly pick up, and heard something colder than silence. An automated message that his number was no longer in service. All I could do was end the call. What spurred me out of my stupor was a duty to do right by my dad's legacy. When someone close to you dies, people tell you that they live on inside of you. That is not true. They are only with you to the extent you carry them. It requires effort and courage. I no longer had my dad's dreams to fulfill, but I had my own to create. I wrote about these dreams in my What Matters Most to You and Why essay. I wrote about how starting a great company or being a great leader didn't matter to me the way it used to. And this is coming from someone who had a lot of medals. I started to care more about grabbing hold of the small opportunities life affords every day. I began trying to give others in my life complete empathy by really feeling the joy of their successes and the pains of their suffering as if they were my own. I wanted to be for them the family I so desperately needed. I created a list of friends who had lost loved ones and kept track of their loved ones' birthdays and dates of passing, so I could be there for them on those days, even if it had been years since their loved one's death. More than anything, I wanted people to feel like their life was better because we crossed paths. Oftentimes, this manifests in something as simple as humor. My friends know I love to tell jokes in person or over text, but what is perceived as lightheartedness comes from somewhere heavier. If I can make you smile, if I can bring you joy in a world that I have seen to be so dark, I have done my job for the day. I have carried my dad. But I also drop him. I drop him. For all the wisdom I gained that I've been forced to learn, I don't always act upon it. I fail and I drop him. And I fear I do it more often as the years since his killing go by. My arms grow tired and I forget where I was headed. I begin to sweat the small things again. The long line for coffee at Coupa, the font for Halloween invitations, the results of the GSB registration website. None of these things, and indeed most things, don't matter, except for the GSB registration website, which didn't place me in any of my top super round picks. In these moments, I worry I'm returning to the Anthony I was when I first told my story at Yale, and that my dad's death was for nothing. I suppose that's why I write about him and give talks about him. Returning to the past, to my Upper West Side apartment, to the courtroom with his killer, to the room where I saw my dad corrode into ash, forces me to relive it. But in that pain, I feel him, and I'm reminded to pick him up, carry him, and tell our story so others can help me carry him too. So you can help me carry him too. I titled my talk Otherwise after a poem written by Jane Kenyon. In the poem, Kenyon reflects on the routines of everyday life, the precious moments we take for granted, waking up, getting out of bed, having dinner, making plans with someone you love, and how it can all change in an instant. I never knew the last moments I had with my dad would be just that. The last vivid memory I have of him was in New York. We were sitting on the bench near the Hudson River, eating ice cream. He smiled as the wind whipped through his hair, not a gray strand in sight. He looked happy. I was so happy. I talked about a lot of truths tonight. Dark truths, hidden truths, forgotten truths. But perhaps the realest truth is that I would trade all the wisdom I've gained, the person I've become, everything I have for just one more moment with my dad. To see his breath while he slept and watch the bristles of his mustache sway underneath. To hear his voice say my name. To sit with him in my room and do one last math problem. I wish so badly it were otherwise. But it's not. So I write, I speak, I carry, I talk, all the while knowing that nothing I do in this lifetime can make up for my dad's death. But maybe goodness can bloom in those willing to hear my mourning. An elegy, though written about the dead, is for the living, is for you. I hope you let a small part of yourself be changed tonight. I hope that in you, goodness blooms. Please don't let it be otherwise. Thank you.